All right. So we are here in Alpbach, and it's the perfect place to remind us how much topography has influenced human development. Right? Here you can see a map of Austria, and you have the red areas, which are mountains, the green areas, which are the plains with rivers. And this is a night map, where you can see the lights. And where there's lights, there's people. When there's people, there's wealth. And when you compare the two, you can see how, for example, here, this is Vienna, Bratislava, this is Salzburg, this is Munich. You can see they're all in the areas that have plains. And where there's mountains, there's nothing, right? There's no human development, except for maybe here, these lines, which are rivers. And so, why is this? Well, because when there's a plain and there's rivers, you can do agriculture. You can have food, the more people, the more wealth. Also, if you have flat land, it's easier to move, so it's easier to trade. And if you have rivers, it's also even easier to trade, and trade is wealth. So the flatter, the more rivers, the more wealth. And you can see this everywhere in the world. This is Italy, and you can see exactly the same thing. Everywhere there is land, flat land, and there's rivers, there is a population, and there's wealth. Here, for example, you can see the Po Valley. This is a picture of the Bay Area in San Francisco, and you can see that everything is built on the flat. And the moment you have the mountains, you don't build, because it's so much more expensive. This is now zooming out, a map of Europe, and you can see that there's mountains in all the south, there's a North European plain in the north. And why is this? Well, because you have the African tectonic plate going into the Eurasian plate and forming all these mountains. These mountains gather a lot of water. This water falls very, very fast into the Mediterranean, but very slowly into the northern European plain, creating lots of rivers that are navigable. All these plains, all these rivers, all this wealth. I hope you remember this next time you criticize your Southern Europeans for being lazy. So, geography has driven history for thousands of years. And so if you ask this guy from the 1500s, hey, how is history, how are politics going to evolve over the next few centuries? He's going to say, well, it's going to be the same. Right? It's been the same for 500 to 1,000 years. We've had this feudalist system, and sometimes there's one lord or another, but it's broadly the same. And the Catholic Church has been around for 500 years, and the Christian Church for over 1,000 years. And you know, there's been some challenges over the years, right? There's been some proto-Protestant movements since the very beginning of the church, but every time a new Protestant movement appeared, you would have the Catholic Church prevailing over all these proto-Protestant movements. And so you would say, yeah, sure, it's going to stay like this for centuries. And then a few decades later, boom, you have the Protestant Reformation. And the Catholic Church is split in two. So what's the difference between these two? Between Jan Hus in the 1400s and Martin Luther in the 1500s. And the huge difference is this. On the right, you have the handwritten books that were the method for information dissemination in the 1400s. And then in the middle of that century, you have Gutenberg's printing press. And that starts changing history. Geography is not as big a driver, and as technology develops, it's more and more of a driver of history. And one way to look at this is from the standpoint of information networks. Right? This is a village, and how does a village work? You have a bunch of people who talk with each other all the time, and you might have the nobleman and the priest, but they don't talk too much with other villages like them. You know, there's a little bit of trade, but you don't go to the other valley to speak with this other village all the time. Then you have a fractal system where the villages talk with the main cities a little bit, and the main cities with the bigger cities, and that is reflected in the aristocracy, in the feudalist system, which is, as we know, fractal, right? You have knights and barons and dukes and kings, and the same thing is true for the clergy, right? You have priests and beacons and all that, and cardinals and the pope, with the very big difference that the church has a substantially denser information network, right? In fact, they had a monopoly on information at the time because the clergy was very well educated. They had access to lots of handwritten books that they could write because they could afford to have people writing them. They spoke Latin, so they could read all these books, which other people couldn't read because at that time you have the local vernaculars, the local dialects. It's not Latin anymore. Which means that they also have a monopoly on the Word of God, which is so important at the time. And they have correspondence across all of Europe. So they have a huge monopoly on information, which disappears with the printing press, right? Because at that point, before the printing press, it took a year to write a book, and then once you have one book, only one person can consume it at a time. But with the printing press, it also takes a bunch of time to print a book. But when you print a book, you can print thousands of them. And so you can distribute that information across all of Europe. Lots of aristocrats can read it. Lots of merchants can read it. And all of this is done in the vernacular, so it's much more accessible to anybody. And that change in information networks was one of the reasons why the church really lost a lot of power, because it didn't have the monopoly of information anymore. And that reduction in power would have really surprised this guy here, because he wouldn't have seen it coming after what happened over the last few centuries. Right? And something very similar happened with languages. Before the printing press, you have a gradient of speech from, say, Wallonia to Portugal. It's different nuances, changes little by little of Latin, right? One valley speaks nearly the same language as the other valley with some differences, and then you continue going on and on and on. And the same thing is true for German languages. But then you suddenly start having the printing press, and you print the books wherever there's a writer, wherever there's an audience, in the language of the biggest areas, right? So Paris, Florence, Toledo, and these language from those areas then become widespread, and that's what people outside of that area start speaking, start understanding, because otherwise they don't have access to information. And that's how you suddenly have, not suddenly, over the centuries, this emergence of these Portuguese, French, Italian, German, that you didn't have before. It is because of technologies like the printing press. And once you have that, suddenly people are sharing their identity, because now everybody's speaking the same language and they're sharing the same ideas, and that's where how you go from feudalism to nation states. What I showed before is in the Middle Ages, and this is in the 1600s, and you can see substantially bigger countries, much more unified, and that would have been completely impossible before, right? This guy, he knows a world that's feudal and with a big church, and suddenly the church is losing its power, it's dividing, and you have these big nation states that are appearing. And something very similar happened a few centuries later, right? You have the totalitarian movements that appear in the 20th century, and they don't appear in the 19th century, they don't appear in the 18th century, they appear in the 20th century. And why is that? Because of this, because of technology, right? You can't speak to 100,000, 1 million people in a big square if you don't have a microphone and speakers. You can't give your propaganda to millions of people if you don't have the radio. And so, over the centuries, more and more of these broadcasting systems appear, and each one of them strengthens the nation state, which controls all these gatekeepers, right? You have, for example, the big TV channels and the radio channels, and the government has control over them and influences what they say. And what they say is the main information source for the people. And so what they think is directly influenced by nation states. And the feedback loop is pretty weak. You don't have citizens telling broadcasters what to talk about. And so that's how you get the strong nation states that we have today. Then come information networks, and they come to destroy all of this. Why? Because suddenly everybody can talk to each other. So before, the technology of broadcasting is one to many, right? One person, one group produces the content, and many people consume it. Now we're changing this network to many. Anybody can talk and communicate to anybody. And if technology has driven the political systems in the past, how is this new technology going to change the political systems of the future? And so here are a few tips on where it might go. This is my article, one of my articles about coronavirus, the hammer and the dance. My articles were read by around 60 million people, and they influenced policies of governments around the world, which is crazy, right? I'm a tech person. I build technology products. I work in information networks. And then I write an article on epidemiology, and it influences epidemiology around the world. So this is completely nuts. And it would have been completely impossible even 20 years ago, right? How does a person like me, a normal person like me, end up in this position? Well, there were a lot of scientific papers around that I could read, and I packaged them in an article that was compelling, and then just people read it. And I could distribute those through internet. I couldn't have access to that information without information networks. I couldn't distribute this information without information networks. And these ended up with the citizen having influence, a little bit of influence on some nation states. And the same way as I have that influence, anybody now can have this influence, right? So there's going to be more power to citizens than there was before. Not only that, but obviously social networks have more power over nation states. It's not only that they enable the distribution of information so that citizens can decide what they think, but also sometimes they decide what the truth is, like when they decided what information about COVID was true and what was not. In some cases, they can even shut down the voice of some nation states. You have the supranational organizations, like the World Health Organization or the European Union, and they're also getting more power. To me, the failures of the World Health Organization mattered so much only because it was so important to have an organism that worked well. In a world that is connected globally, problems are global, and so you need global organizations to solve them. And over history, technology and governance raises to the level of the scope of the problems. The European Union also did something like this. At the beginning of the pandemic, they didn't do much. They really took the lead in vaccinations in Europe, and the result is what we're seeing today in the European Union, which is a substantially better outcome than anywhere else in the world. You have data brokers too, for example. And what they do is they compare easily country to country, and that takes away power from nation states. Because now you can say, hey, Austria, your prevalence is pretty good. Spain, you're not doing that good a job. What's up? And now the government has to justify themselves or change their policies. And that takes away sovereignty from the nation states. And we have Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies, and blockchain. We're going to talk about that in a second. But this is another way that sovereignty from nation states is eroding. There's more power to international organizations. We need to talk about automation a little bit too. So here you can see a graph of the 4.5 million retail salespeople in the United States. And according to two academics in 2013, Frey and Osborne, the black is going to be those who will lose their job by, I think, 2050 because of automation. Right? This is the list of the top 50 jobs. And the black are all the ones that are supposed to be automated away. Obviously, you had this conversation in the past, and the argument is, yeah, there's going to be job destruction, but there's going to be also a lot of job creation. We know this because it happened in the past. The same thing happened in the Industrial Revolution. Well, let's talk about the Industrial Revolution. In the middle of the 19th century, in the United States, 70% of Americans worked in agriculture. In Europe, it's similar. And it took 130 years for that to be automated away. In the meantime, you have all these industries that appear that were very labor intensive. So you have more jobs that appear, and that counterbalances the jobs that disappear in agriculture. Even then, with 130 years for that transition, you have massive displacement, massive discontent, which peak into the 1848 revolts across Europe. That same day, that same year, you have Karl Marx, who writes the Communist Manifesto, birthing a new political system from a new technology. But now things are substantially faster. If a century and a half ago, it took 80 years for 25% of Americans to use dishwashers, now it takes years or even months for people to adopt a new technology. So everything is much faster. Travel, for example, we know how fast it has gone, how much we've moved our bookings from the phone to internet. And in 12 years, half of the workers in travel agents have lost their jobs. That's not 130 years, that's 12 years. Oil rigs in the United States, there was a crash in the oil price in 2015. Oil rigs went down, employment went down, and when the oil rigs went up, employment didn't go down because the automation happened in a matter of months, not centuries. So job destruction is going to be fast. Each time the technology goes into an industry, it changes the employment very, very fast. How fast will job creation be? Well, not that fast because technology is very efficient, right? What does technology do? It takes a variable cost into a fixed cost. So for example, all the things that you can see here, oh, it doesn't, that's fine. All the things that you can see here are built by physical people, and they're distributed by physical people, and they're sold by physical people. But all of these things that you can see here have been automated away into a technology, into an internet technology. And that is a bunch of engineers and product managers and designers in a room building that thing. And once it's built, it costs nothing to distribute it. And so this is how you have all these workers around the world, and each time one of these big tech companies builds something, it eliminates jobs across the world and concentrates a lot of that wealth creation into the headquarters of these companies. Right? Advertising. Google makes more money than the US newspapers and print magazines together. But for every $1 million that each one of these make, newspapers and magazines employ 11 people, and Google employs 0.9. So it has 12 times fewer employee per dollar than traditional industries. Blockbuster and Netflix is an even better example. You have 8 times fewer, at the height of Blockbuster, they had 60,000 employees and a $5 billion valuation. Netflix has 8 times fewer people and was worth a couple of years, 32 times more, which means that per dollar, for each employee that Netflix had, Blockbuster had 240. Kodak, at the height, had 150,000 employees. Instagram, when it was bought, it was $1 billion and 12 employees. That's $85 million of value created per employee. WhatsApp, $22 billion. That turns out to $400 million created per employee. And with all that wealth generation, you can have very good salaries to pay for that, which means that it's not only the founders of these companies, but also the workers that work in tech companies that make a bunch of money. And that is growing as a share of GDP, but because they're so efficient, the share of GDP from tech employees is not. So forecast this 30, 40 years, and imagine what happens to employment, right? And that's because tech is by far much, much more productive and grows in productivity compared to all other industries. So when you look back at all these jobs here, the top 50 jobs, 47 of them were jobs that existed 60 years ago or more. There's only 3 types of jobs in the top 50 that are new. And what do? They work on automating the other 47. So when you do this, what you end up is a reduction of the middle class, medium skill jobs, and an increase of the some high skill jobs and a lot of low skill jobs. You have what's called a hollow out. And if you project these into the future, you get more and more people in the low skill jobs with low income and fewer in the middle income. And that's why we're not seeing unemployment dramatically going up, because people need to work even if their job is worse and they go into the low income, low skill kind of jobs. And this is how you end up today with the 26 wealthiest people in the world owning as much wealth as the bottom 3.5 billion. So we're going to have accelerated wealth generation, but it's going to be localized in a few areas, and there's going to be substantial more inequality. But those people who are wealthy, they can also move around substantially more easily, right? They don't have now some manufacturing plant that forces them to be somewhere. They can go anywhere they want. They can move their business anywhere they want. And this is how, for example, in Spain, a bunch of YouTubers who were making millions of euros moved to Andorra, which is very close by, and now they're operating there and paying a fifth of the taxes that they used to pay in Spain. And it's now not only these founders and these creators, but it's going to come to any worker, any remote worker. During the pandemic, around 30% of EU workers, on all EU workers, were working remotely, and about 70% of Americans. After the COVID, it's going to go down, but it's not going to go to zero. And all these people, they're mobile. They can go work anywhere they want. Do you think they're going to go to the places where they're taxed the most? So it's going to be harder to tax these remote employees, the creators, the people who found these companies. And these companies now, something like Google, they had all these employees in the Bay Area of San Francisco, and they couldn't move as easily. But if they become remote, how easily is it going to be to tax a company like Google? Employees are everywhere, servers are everywhere. How do we tax it? If you look at the top 25 countries in the world in GDP per capita, the yellow ones, 2/3 are basically tax havens. So this is not something new. It has been happening for decades. Wealthy people move and themselves and their companies to places where they don't pay taxes. So imagine in a new world where mobility is substantially higher. There's going to be more competition between all of these organizations too, right? The tax rate in this country is 10%. Let's have it 8% in my country so we can attract more people. And there's been already a bunch of hubs that have been doing this extremely successfully over the last few decades, right? Shenzhen, Dubai, Singapore, Hong Kong. None of them, like all of them were basically backwaters a few decades ago. And now there are some global hubs. And there's many more like them. There's city-states, there's special economic zones that can tax less to attract more business. And there's more that are coming. Here, for example, some charter cities that are trying to be built in Honduras. So there's going to be probably new policies like this that enable people to try to attract people and their wealth. Then we have cryptocurrencies, blockchain, Bitcoin, and there's a couple of effects. One of them is it's much harder to print all the money that you want if there's an alternative, like Bitcoin, where you cannot print the money. And so the more people realize this, the more they buy Bitcoin, the less they rely on fiat currencies like the euro or the dollar, and the harder it is to finance yourself by printing money the way governments have been doing over the last 10 to 15 years. Not only that, but what blockchain does really is eliminate gatekeepers. You don't need, before you have the central bank of a country that says, yes, I'm printing this money, it's good, you can trust me. So you had a gatekeeper, and that gatekeeper can take advantage of that, right, by printing money, for example. You can't do that with blockchain anymore because the rules are very clear to all, and everybody makes sure that they are abided to. Who watches the watchmen? Everybody. And that's what blockchain does. And it can do this for any industry that is based on information with a gatekeeper. That's banking, insurance, investing, incorporation, legislation, real estate, notaries, music, energy management, legal system, education. All of these are industries that are information industries with gatekeepers. These gatekeepers gave power to nation states. You take away the gatekeepers, you take away the power of nation states. So you can't finance with printing by printing money, and you don't have gatekeepers. And finally, this is a picture of workers in the Encyclopedia Britannica a few decades ago. And how did they write their articles? They got in a room, they talked with each other, they analyzed, they looked at data, they might interview a few people, they think a lot, and then they create an article, and poof, they publish it. And then came Wikipedia. And at the beginning, everybody said, it's impossible to have good articles from Wikipedia. Well, it turns out that you have substantially more quantity, much faster, and actually more quality. Why? Because the way to think about Wikipedia is the knowledge that exists in the entire world is obviously going to be substantially more than in a group of people in a room. What was missing was a mechanism to harness all this knowledge. And that's what Wikipedia is, a mechanism to harness the knowledge of the crowd for encyclopedic articles. Now let's take this to the legislative process. What is this? It's a bunch of people gathering in a room, talking with each other, interviewing a few people, analyzing a little bit of data, and then they push out some articles, which are called laws. Information networks and things like blockchains can completely change this, because the knowledge that exists in the population is substantially more than in the brains of legislators. We're just missing a mechanism to put all of this information together. But that mechanism is going to come. So there is going to be a different decision-making process for all of the economy, but especially true for nation states. And all of this is happening at the worst time. The European population is going to peak in 2021. That's because for decades we haven't had kids. And thankfully, life expectancy has been going up. As a result, though, the number of retirees per worker has gone from 0.1 to 0.3 recently, and it's going to go to 0.6 in the next few decades. And that's at a moment where already 20% of government budgets in the United States, in Europe, 20% is dedicated to retirements. So how will we be able in Europe to afford all these costs if we have fewer people to pay for them, we're not letting migrants in, we can't print money, we can't generate wealth, and we can't attract it or tax it? Thankfully, all these problems lead to a lot of these solutions, right? If you don't have enough people, well, you need to get people. If there's laws that prevent wealth from being generated, well, you need laws to enable this wealth generation. If you want to attract wealth, you need to deregulate and you need to lower taxes. And maybe the promises that you made to some people, you cannot respect them anymore, so you shouldn't try. And so all of these are like the 95 Theses of Martin Luther 500 years ago that marked the movement from one political system to another political system. And so we need these 95 Theses for the 21st century to move from nation states to the future governance systems. Thank you.